Hey everybody, my guest today is Professor Sophie Grace Chappell, and we're going to talk about what it means to be trans in a cisgender world. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I was hoping that you could give a brief introduction.
Well, I'm Professor of Philosophy at the Open University. I'm one of the editors of the Philosophical Quarterly. I've written a fair number of books. I do translations and I write poetry and I climb mountains. I do various things.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So you wrote a book, and I was hoping that you could give a quick summary of your book.
The book's called Transfigured, and it comes out on April the 12th, 2024. And the subtitle is On Being a Transgender Person in a Cisgender World. And that's basically what it's about. It's about what it's been like for me to be someone who is a trans woman in a cis world, a world which is not trans, in the way that I am. And it's about that. So it uses autobiographical narrative and philosophical argument and a certain amount of myth busting and poetry and science fiction and various other forms of presentation to talk about these topics.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed reading your book. If you were to summarize, I guess, like what it's been like being trans in a cisgender world, would you say that it's been overall negative, overall very difficult, that there have been a number of obstacles in front of you, and that there have been more antagonists and people who've been against you than supporters?
I'd say it's been weird and wonderful. It is undoubtedly strange being transgender in a cisgender world, and it's especially strange when you come to that understanding of yourself in full. When you kind of understand that when you're very little, but you move away from it because of social pressure on you and because you're under psychological pressure not to think of yourself as trans, and you get back to that and realize that's what it was all along, which happened to me between 1998 and 2008. So it's weird but wonderful. I would say, you asked me to choose between positive and negative. I'd say positive, but also, very positive. I'm happy, very happy to be who I am. I'd also say inevitable, because there isn't another way for me to be. I don't really get to choose. Trans is the way I am, and so it's the way I want to be, but it's also the way I am. I don't have much choice in the matter. And in a way, that makes the fact that you do get people sometimes who somehow it seems to explode their little world that I'm different from them. That makes that, in a way, less difficult to cope with, because I know I couldn't do differently from how I do.
And that makes sense. Do you think that the people who are, I guess, critical, I don't know how you want to describe them, skeptical, or do you think that mainly comes from a misunderstanding of what it means to be trans?
I think it comes from lots of places. I think that a lot of people are genuinely afraid of trans. The situation is different in different countries too. So in the US, at least in the right bits of the US, I was in Connecticut recently, and it was like a weight lifting from my shoulders arriving in Connecticut from the UK, because there's just this constant weight, this pressure of trans exclusionary attitudes, of hatred of trans people in the UK, which the right wing politically and the media and various other prominent people on social media, they're all pushing this line, and you get to Connecticut and it's not like that, and it's really liberating. It's like a weight lifts from your shoulders. To address your question a little more closely, I think that people have lots of reasons for being trans exclusionary, which is what I'd call it. I think some of them, as I say, have been made genuinely afraid by myths that they've heard about us. I think some of them at the other end of the spectrum, if you like, there's nothing sincere about what they're doing. It's a political move. They think that there's votes to be won out of hating trans people, and it appears that at least in some places they're right.
In general, I like to see the good in people. I want to be optimistic. I want to believe that if there's conflict, it could be resolved via civil dialogue. Now, I don't know if that's true in every case, but that's something that I like to believe. And so I'm hoping that for many people who are, I guess, critical or skeptical, it just comes from a misunderstanding. And so to that extent, I'm hoping that works like yours can garner greater alliance and more support for trans people and what they're going through. So
that's exactly what I was hoping for in writing. I was hoping that I think a lot of the time we're demonized and we're othered, trans people are, and we're treated as if we don't have faces. And we're treated as if we're not really human. In the UK at the moment, I think that the current UK government, I think, is absolutely abominable about trans people. They treat us like vermin. They treat us like a plague. And one of the ways in which I hope my book will make a difference is by showing people who don't know about trans people and maybe don't know any personally, showing them that we're real and we're essentially harmless. We're not a threat to anybody. We're like the planet Earth and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, mostly harmless. And some of us are actually, what do you know? We might even be fun to know. So I think humanizing people who are trans is one of the main things I want to do in Transfigured, trying to help people figure out what transgender is by showing them that actually, as a friend of mine said when she found out I was trans, it's no biggie. It's not a big deal. Some people are trans, some people aren't. So what?
Yeah, that's well put. So I guess I'm not as familiar with what's going on in the UK. Can you briefly describe it?
Well, I think we've got a government which is desperate, which is circling the plug hole, which is going down the tubes pretty fast, and they're thrashing around looking for people to hate. And the biggest target, the biggest group that they want people to hate is people who are refugees or asylum seekers or migrants, three quite different groups, which they band together in their hatred campaign. So this government bangs on and on about the threat posed to, the supposed threat posed to the rest of us by migrants. And because they're crude, they're a government of crude hate, so visible differences are what they go for. And a lot of trans people don't, as the saying is, pass. It's fairly obvious that we started out in one gender and are now living in another, particularly trans women. So we're another visible target. And so we get all this vitriol from a government that doesn't have anything positive to offer. All they have to offer is negativity and hate. And that's what they're doing, I'm afraid. And it breaks my heart to see it. But I think that's a fair description of what's going on.
I'd see. So on the one hand, there's like the political stuff that's going on that I guess I wasn't really aware of. And then perhaps a different thing is maybe some of the philosophy that's come out. And I'm wondering if you necessarily group them together, or do you see one as having a legitimate and authentic a disagreement, and whereas the other one is just about political gains?
I think there are people who argue a line about trans people, which is trans exclusionary. I think there are people who do that in philosophy in probably imperfectly good faith. I think there are also people, even in philosophy, though I'd rather not give names, who are rather grandstanding on this issue and are seeking to make some kind of career capital out of it. Well, okay, I'll give you one name. I think Jordan Peterson does that. So I think there are people who are, in my view, not in good faith and are using this issue to express their own phobias and to express their own insecurities, and in line with the rest of a platform which is very much in line with the kind of right-wing politics, essentially bigoted politics that I've been describing. And I would think that Jordan Peterson fits into that. But I think there are also people in philosophy who have genuine questions about transgender because, for example, they come from a particular kind of feminist background. And people who come out of that background very often think that the objective in the end is to get rid of gender. They see gender as a bad thing and sex, well, not necessarily as a good thing, but as a biological reality. And they think that gender is a kind of prison, and they want people to be set free from that prison. And I'm not entirely unsympathetic to that. I think that gender can be a kind of dress-up box of roles that people are made to play by society, which can be very constraining, very damaging, and I think can be part of female oppression. So people who are coming from that kind of background, I think to some extent I understand their concerns. I don't always understand what seems to me like often a rather unhinged hostility to actual trans people. But I understand the concern that women in particular, biological women in particular, should not be trapped by traditional gender roles because those are part of patriarchy and because those oppress people. I understand that concern.
When I started thinking more about, I guess, the patriarchy and leftist issues, I did get the sense that gender norms were bad. And I think I actually made an effort to break gender normativity because I thought that they were so oppressive. And not only towards women, but also men, right? Like we had these, right, the expectations that men don't cry, right? That are actually quite harmful. And so I thought like, well, it seems to me that the ultimate goal is to kind of destroy gender categories altogether, destroy these stereotypes, destroy these norms. It doesn't matter if you're a boy or not. Boys can cry. It's healthy to cry, right? It doesn't matter if you're a girl. You can do anything that you want. You can have whatever type of hair that you want, right? And so I guess I can kind of see where the disagreement lies if the goal is to destroy these gender categories.
Yeah. Yes, I think there are a lot of things in the gender role dress-up box, as I called it a moment ago. There are a lot of things in there, and some of them are constraining and bad, and some of them are just ways of marking that you have a particular. I mean, if some people say that a gender is a perceived biological sex, and so you want to underline the word perceived there. It's a perceived biological sex. And then a lot goes on with the perception. And I think some things in the gender dress-up box are really very harmful and constraining. And other things are just, they're a kind of play. They're a kind of enjoyment of accepting that there are some kind of gender roles, and we can use that creatively. We can use that in ways that are fun and that are self-expressive. And none of that need be harmful at all. So, you can imagine, I keep calling it a dress-up box, so let's go with that. There might be, let's say, a corset in there. Now, some people like wearing corsets. I think they're one of the most uncomfortable garments ever invented. And I don't think it's accidental at all. I think a corset, with the traditional steel bars in it and these very tight straps that people pull around themselves to make themselves an hourglass shape. I think that is, sticking with the metaphor of the dress-up box, I think that's gender roles becoming literally physically oppressive and painful upon the body. But there are other things that might be in that dress-up box that are just a bit of fun. People sometimes like to wear a feather boa. It's a kind of fun thing that you might want to wear when you're feeling a little bit boisterous, a little bit outrageous. And I don't see why that kind of play shouldn't be available to people. And it might signal a lot of things, of course. It might signal that you're Frank Converter in the Rocky Horror Show. It might signify that you're a man who wants to muck around. It's also, there are codes in there that the trans people and the trans women and cis women can use if they choose, if they want to. That's the thing that they can do. And so for those who are just outright abolitionists about gender roles, I think, just spinning out from there and generalizing what I'm saying there, I think there's a lot in gender roles that we can have fun with, that we can play with, and that we can use to be part of our self-expression. Because I think it's a general thing about the various kind of roles and norms that we find imposed on ourselves, that we can go three ways with them. We can say, this is all bad, I want rid of all of this. Or we can say, it's a little bit bad. Or we can say it's all good, and I'm happy with all of it. And I submit to the patriarchy, and I'm not advocating either of those. I'm saying we should go down the middle. We should pick and choose and say, well, we can do this with gender roles and we can do that, but maybe we shouldn't do that because that does look like a vestige of oppression, which we're better off without.
That makes perfect sense because, dressing up, like, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that, right? Whereas you would think that other aspects of gender normativity are actually wrong and bad and that we should get rid of. So It's perfectly fine to keep some of the stuff, right? Yeah. So this relates to my first question, which is, how you see the difference between sex and gender. Like, do you see them as two different things? How do they relate to each other?
Yeah, I think basically sex is biology and gender is social psychology. That's roughly how I put it. So I said a minute ago that gender is perceived sex, and from as far back as we know, humans, like other species, have always had various kinds of ritual around sexual differences or the perceived sexual differences. So beings, creatures, see each other as of the different sexes, and because of that, they interact differently. And it's in the behavior and in the perception and in the roles that you get to talk about gender, whereas it's at the level of bodies that you're talking about sex.
Okay. And you said something I thought was very interesting in your book. You said that you wanted to change both your sex and gender, and that changing each is a means to changing the other.
Yes,
And
that's right.
yeah, could you kind of elaborate on that?
Well, I think one misconception that's quite common about trans people is that trans people just want the female gender role. And that's clearly mistaken. There's a whole literature of trans autobiographical narratives on this, going back, for example, to Jan Morris's wonderful book, Conundrum, from, I think, the 1970s. And Jan Morris is explicit that when she was born a biological male, and as a biological male, she got clearer and clearer in her mind that she wanted a different body. And she wanted her body to be a female body. And eventually she was one of the first well-known people to be someone who had gender reassignment surgery. And as we call it, I think the terminology is confused, incidentally, because it's not the gender that's being changed, it's a biological change, as I define gender. So people have been very clear all along that they're not just interested in gender role, they're interested in the bodily change too. Now, there might be someone who is just interested in the gender change. I don't think that's typical of trans people from what I know of them. And it's not true of me. I don't just want to be treated as a woman. I don't just want to be recognized as a woman, although that's certainly important. I want to be a woman, physically as well as psychologically and socially. And so that's the kind of difference I'm getting at when I say that thing. Of course, people want the recognition. They want the social space that's afforded to them by people publicly recognizing them as women or as men, as the case may be. But those trans people who are like me, they want the physical change too.
Okay, that leads to my next question, which is, what if we lived in a gender-neutral world where everybody kind of presented themselves in the same way? Would your desire to change your sex still exist in that world?
Yes, because it's a desire about the body, and a world where there were no gender roles is a possible world, or a world that was dominated by the female, the woman's gender role. And in Listeness, at the end of my book, Transfigured, I do a bit of science fiction, playing around with that possibility, what it would be like if everybody in the society was a woman, either cis or trans. Everybody is a woman, except for a few freaks, a few exceptions. The whole society is dominated by the feminine. Now, you can imagine a society where you can imagine beings where there are no bodily differences, but there are gender differences. And there's a book, The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin, where she explores something like that possibility. So in The Left Hand of Darkness, the aliens that Ursula Le Guin is talking about, their bodies don't normally differ. They only differ every now and then when they get in the mood or the hormonal state for reproduction. Most of the time, their bodies are the same. They're all the same. But to some extent, there are gender roles which float free of the way their bodies are. So you can imagine a world like that, where there are gender roles, but there aren't permanent sexual differences. You can imagine a world where it's the other way around, where there are sexual differences, but not gender roles. And because I think most trans people want to make the transition both of gender and of sex, there are things we'd still want to do in either of those worlds. But of course, there are also people who describe themselves as non-binary, and I take it that's exactly what they mean by this. Either at the level of gender or at the level of sex, or at both levels, they just want a world where there aren't these differences, and where these differences, even if they exist, the physical differences, they're not taken to be important. Nothing hangs on them.
I had a lot of conversations with one of my friends about being trans, and she's trans. I asked her, is it really about like how other people perceive you? Is it about society? Or let's say that you were just like on an island or in a cave, like by yourself, right? Like, how would you feel? And my friend said, I would still hate my body. It's independent of what other people think.
Yeah. Yes. I'm not sure. I mean, there have been times when it's felt like hate of my own body, and there have been times when it's been depression about the way my body is. And I think there's kind of frustration there. But yeah, I think it's sad if it comes out as hatred of one's own body, especially if it's possible and easy. And it is for some people and it isn't for others for all sorts of reasons. If it's possible and easy to change your body, then if you're trans, then you'd hope that you would end up not hating yourself in that way. But if I was on a desert island, would I still be trans? Yes, absolutely. Because there'd be the bodily aspect to the way I am. And there'd still be, I mean, a single person is still a society in a way, in a kind of Augustinian way. You still talk to yourself. You still have attitudes to yourself. And I'd still know that Sophie Grace is who I am. That's still who I'd be, alone on a desert island. And when I talk to myself, that's the name that I use. So none of that would change.
Another thing that my friend said was that everything was very triggering because the world was just gendered. So every time she had to use the public restroom, she was triggered. Every time she went maybe like clothes shopping, she was triggered. And just a general impression that I got is that just her being trans caused so much suffering in her life, And I find that to be a common theme when I read autobiographical works about trans people. And that makes me think that the most appropriate immediate response is compassion.
Uh-huh.
What would you say to that?
I think in the current state of things, that's often a fair reaction. I think compassion is not the main thing I'm looking for. I mean, one thing I'm actually looking for is uninterest. I like it when people, they're just not bothered that I'm trans any more than they're bothered that I have this color hair or brown eyes or whatever. It's just a thing about me. And they say, yeah, sure, let's carry on. Where should we go for supper? They change the subject. They're just relaxed about it. But of course, in the world we're in, compassion and solidarity is certainly necessary. I mean, I think things can get less painful. And I think this is why people transition, either socially or physically or both. For me, I talk quite a lot in Transfigured about, the sheer pain that certain things that I could see on the telly would cause me. So, for example, there would be certain adverts I would see where I saw a particularly entrancing vision of how I'd like to look and what I'd like to be. And I'd have to leave the room. And I'd literally cover my face and leave the room because I couldn't bear it, because I wanted that so much and because I was so distant from that. So it's immensely healing to get as close as you can to the kind of ideals that you have of how you'd like to be and how you'd like to look. It's very healing to do that. It's very healing to know that you can try that. It can be frustrating because, of course, I don't look exactly as I'd like to do. I'm nowhere near how I'd like to be. And there's no transphobic troll on the internet who's thought of a criticism of my appearance that I haven't thought of myself. So, of course, you have to go through all that. But then, welcome to the human race. Most human beings do not look exactly as they want to look. Most human beings, cis or trans, struggle sometimes with their appearance. And all human beings, I think, also need, and this sounds slightly harsh, but I think it's true, we need to some extent just to get over ourselves and to accept that we're not perfect and we're never going to be. That's life. That's life. And as you get older, of course, it gets harder to look the way you want to do. But here am I, I'm nearly 60, and I don't think I'm a total train wreck.
one of the ways that I try to understand what the issues are and just look what the concepts are is just hearing what trans people have to say about themselves and in the trans community. And I quickly realized that there were strong disagreements within the trans community of, I guess, like what it meant to be trans, for instance. And it's hard for me to understand because I'm not part of that community, but something that you said earlier made me think of this. So one thing that you said was, ideally, I just don't want people to care. I don't want people to be interested in the fact that I'm trans. They just like know that I'm trans and then they move on, right?
Yeah.
So
basic human solidarity, but no big deal being made of it.
Yeah. And the reason why that made me think of like some of the disagreements that I've heard amongst trans people is that you have some trans people who pretty much echoed what you said, right? You just like, look, like trans people, all we want to do is just live our lives the way that we feel like, authentic, right? We don't necessarily want to draw attention to ourselves. We don't want people taking all this interest towards us. And the way that some other trans activists are handling the issue is counter to that goal. And I guess I'm not entirely sure what that means.
Well, I think it means that trans people, like, if you go into feminist groups or if you go into men's mutual support groups, you'll find huge divergences of opinion there too. So humans are always disagreeing, and the more articulate and the more philosophically trained they are, the more they seem to disagree. I know that my own position as a trans philosopher is a little bit left field compared to some other trans philosophers because of things which are true about me anyway. In general, as a philosopher, I'm a normative ethicist. Normative ethics is what I do probably most of the time. And I'm very different from a lot of normative ethicists these days because of two things in particular. First of all, I'm very historically based. So I do a lot of my thinking via Aristotle and particularly Plato, to some extent Aquinas and Augustine too. And all of that sets me apart from other ethicists. My interest in history, my interest in history is a kind of, ventriloquy. I use it as a way of expressing how I see things against a kind of historical context. And I probably do the historical stuff in place of the thing that other normative ethicists do, which is moral theory. So I'm an anti-theorist. I have a book called Epiphanies. Well, I have 3 books, Ethics and Experience and Knowing What to Do and Epiphanies, are all strongly anti-moral theory. In all of them, I'm saying, well, you can't get a nice, neat, tidy theory of what you should do. When you feed in here the situation, circumstances C, at this end you crank the handle, and out at that end comes the action recommendation, and it's consequentialism or Kantianism or something that does this machine in the middle. And I reject that kind of approach. I say, no, we don't want and we don't need a moral theory in that tight systematic sense. And so when I come to transgender, I'm doing 2 things that other trans philosophers probably don't do. First of all, I'm really interested in the history. And secondly, I'm actively anti-theory. So a lot of my good friends who work in trans philosophy are saying, right, we need a theory of trans. We need a philosophical theory of what trans is. And I'm saying, well, hold on a minute. We don't need theories elsewhere in normative ethics. Why do we need one here? And another thing I'm saying, and I think this is important too, another thing I'm saying in my anti-theoretical mode across the board, I'm saying, don't let people gatekeep you. You don't need the consequentialist permission before you decide to love your husband or wife and your children more than you love other people. You don't need the theorist's permission to do that. You just do it. And I'm saying the same about transgender. You don't need the philosopher's permission to be trans because, here's my adequate theory of being trans. It's systematic. It holds water. It's not logically contradictory. Can I be trans now, please? No, that's precisely what we don't say. We have the right to be trans anyway. We don't need a theory to validate ourselves. So in all those ways, I'm a little bit left field compared with the trans philosophers.
Thank you for that. I'm really glad I'm having this conversation with you. I think this is the first conversation that I've had with a trans philosopher on this specific topic. And so because of your specific training and because of your background, I think you have specific insights and very important insights to provide.
Thank you.
You say in your book that our right to be ourselves without apology and without explanation is simply not up for discussion, any more than anyone else's. We don't get kindly admitted to equal status once we have satisfied our critics. So as far as I know, a lot of the debate is about access to certain spaces like bathrooms and sports, and not necessarily about equal status. I was hoping to get your thoughts on that.
Yes. So the thing is, there's now this debate about, for example, women's restrooms and trans women, or trans people in sports, or whatever it is, women's refuges from domestic violence and rape. There's now a big hullabaloo about all of these. Let's focus on the last of those, because here's a very interesting fact about women's crisis refuge centres. In Scotland, there are, I think, 7 rape crisis centres, and I'm an active supporter of one of them, the nearest to me in Dundee. I give financially to that because I think there's an epidemic of violence against women, including trans women, and it needs to be stopped. But here's the thing. All of these rape crisis centres were trans-inclusive all along. And they were like that for decades. And it was never an issue. And suddenly, in about, 2017, 2018, it begins to be an issue. And suddenly we're hearing all this stuff about how it's a problem. And suddenly we're getting questions posed very disingenuously in the media. Questions of the form, should trans women be admitted to rape crisis centres? As if this is a shocking new proposal that we're going to start admitting trans women to rape crisis centres. Well, the thing is, I want to say when people put this sort of question to me, the thing is, you muttonhead, they're already there and they're not a problem. And they haven't been a problem all along. And now they're a problem because you're making them a problem. And now people are afraid, other women are afraid of trans women in rape crisis centres because you're teaching them to be afraid. And I think there's a shocking level of dishonesty and disingenuousness about this kind of debate. And obviously, if you go back far enough, clearly, if you're visibly a trans woman, as I guess I am, and you try to use the ladies in 1920s Tennessee, it's probably not going to go very well. But from the 70s onwards, although a lot of the time the rules for what was allowed and what wasn't allowed were not very clearly laid down, in lots of places it was just fine, and no one made a fuss about it. And now they're making a fuss about it. And I want to say, why is that? Why is this suddenly a big issue? And I point back again to the politicians who I think are using this kind of thing opportunistically. Trump is clearly doing that in the US. The Conservative government in Britain is doing that. Other governments in Europe are following Britain's suit in that. And of course, all along, Putin's Russia has been an absolute nightmare for trans people, because this is one of the sticks that Putin uses to hit people over the head with to get them to obey him. That, as Jason Stanley nicely puts it, is how fascism works.
So what are your thoughts in regards to the restrooms issue and the sports issue? Do you think that is do you think it's a matter of equal status?
Right. Well, yes, equal status is certainly the place to start from, but there are things to say about both these issues. So let's take them in order. Restrooms first. As I say, for a long time, there was a consensus that in most civilized places, there was a consensus that this was okay and people can talk about it. It may have been technically illegal in some jurisdictions, technically legal in others. In Britain, it was never illegal and still isn't. For someone who is quite clearly and obviously a man, a cis man, to use a woman's toilet in the UK is not an offence. I'm not saying they should. What I'm saying is this. Trans people differ greatly in appearance. Trans women differ greatly in appearance. So someone who wants to impose on all trans women a single law which says you must use the restroom that goes with your birth gender, they're sweeping up all kinds of cases together. So they're sweeping up people like me, of whom it's probably fairly obvious that I'm a trans woman, with people who are trans women but no one would ever know unless they did a medical inspection. And it seems to me obviously and grotesquely unfair and dangerous to treat women who are in fact trans, but you'd never know to look at them. It seems to me grotesque and dangerous to demand that they go in the men's restroom because they were born that way. That's ridiculous. And here's another consequence of this kind of policy. If you demand that everybody goes to the toilet, the restroom that goes with their birth gender, then there are all these big, hairy, butch, muscly trans men who were born as women. They've been on hormones, they've got beards, they've got tattoos, they've got muscles, they've got neck studs. And you're going to demand that they go in the ladies, and that's going to make the ladies a less frightening place to be in. I mean, it seems to me that something like common sense is needed here, actually. It's just a matter of common sense. So there are trans women, and I'm one of them, who sometimes present in a not very trans womanish kind of way because I'm mountaineering or out for a run or whatever. When I'm dressed like that, I do not use the ladies. That seems to me common sense. I think given that I'm a trans woman, I would be entitled to, but I don't think I should exercise that right because I look too much like a man, as people will see it. And it's not fair to do that, so I wouldn't do it. And again, there are also people who say that they're trans women, but they make no effort whatsoever to change their appearance and to look like women. And I think for them, it's not a good idea for them to use the ladies because they might cause alarm and consternation, and they shouldn't do that. But by the same token, neither should a trans man who looks equally butch and yet is a biological woman.
Yeah, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. This is another area of disagreement that I see that some trans people have with each other. Some trans people that I've listened to and read, they say, look, just use the restroom according to the gender that you look like, right?
Yeah.
And so they're not necessarily making a claim about what the law should say. They're just making a claim about how you should behave as an individual, right?
Yeah.
And that seems to make sense, right? Because yeah, like if you just like you said, like maybe somebody who has transitioned and they look like a man, but they use the women's restroom. Maybe, it's going to cause a ruckus. Maybe, women are going to be afraid. But I think perhaps some other trans people think like, well, it shouldn't be about passing because perhaps passing is a sign of privilege and not everybody can pass. And so it should be based on self-ID.
Yeah, I'm sensitive to that kind of argument. And I think that a lot of allowance should be made for people who are in that kind of situation. And it's certainly true that a lot of the things that trans people do to themselves to get the appearance that they want are quite expensive, and not everyone can afford those. And that's one of the reasons why, the mockery of trans people for, you don't look anything like a man, or you don't look anything like a woman, as the case may be. One of the reasons why that's abominable behaviour is because it's class-based behaviour, is because it's economically oppressive, apart from anything else. I think what I would say is that one thing that society at large could do to help trans people is provide more gender-neutral toilets. And it's a striking fact about a lot of the trans-exclusionary people that they steal off the women's toilets from trans women, and they force trans women to use the men's, which is dangerous for the trans women. And they not only don't provide gender-neutral toilets, they actively close them down. They actively prevent gender-neutral toilets from going on existing. And Kemi Badenoch, who is supposed to be the Minister for Equalities in the UK, is absolutely nothing of the sort. She does everything she can to undermine trans equality. And one of the things she's done is close down gender-neutral toilets in her own department in Westminster. I think that's absolutely appalling behaviour. I think that's petty-minded and vindictive and malicious. And I also think it gives the lie to any claim on her part to be trans-inclusive. If you were trans-inclusive, that's the least you would do for them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And something like gender-neutral bathrooms or restrooms would, I think, benefit everybody, right? Because a lot of people want more privacy. Like if I would use them if I could.
Yeah. I mean, when I was living as if I were a cis man, I found actually men's toilets very uncomfortable places. I didn't like being in them at all, for lots of reasons. And one was because they're threatening environments. And I can understand I can understand cis men finding them threatening. Certainly a lot of the men's I've been in were not nice places at all.
I wanted to get your thoughts on sex a little more. So I was hoping that we could dive a little deeper. I think a lot of the confusion or misunderstanding here is exactly what is being changed when a person transitions. So I think a lot of people are willing to, like, if we accept this distinction between sex and gender, a lot of people are willing to accept that you can change your gender, but you cannot change your sex. And so perhaps the terms male and female refer to sex that are immutable, and a man and woman refer to gender, which are immutable. Would you agree with that or not?
Not entirely, because I don't think either is immutable. I mean, there are certain markers of biological sex which science has not yet found a way to change. But people who are trans-exclusionary tend to say two contradictory things about sex. And the first is that sex is a cluster concept. So it depends on chromosomes, it depends on hormones, it depends on physical shape, it depends on physical function, and also it depends on social perception and on psychology. So it's a cluster concept because it involves all of those things. They say that. And if it's a cluster concept, then like any cluster concept, it's a rag bag of different things all taken together. Well, clusters can be disaggregated and different bits of the cluster can be changed. So if it's a cluster concept, and essentially you get to be, X is a woman or X is a man is true, when you tick enough of these boxes, then enough is a flexible concept. How much is enough? There might be people who are, supposing there's an even number of boxes to tick, there might be people who are exactly halfway along. There might be people who are who change in one of those items in the cluster, and therefore the balance in them tips, if it's an odd number, over from 3 to 2 to 2 to 3. And if you genuinely think that it's a cluster concept, then you should view that sex is a cluster concept. Then you should view that 2 to 3 to 3 to 2 moment as a change of sex. But the other thing that they're always saying, trans-exclusionary people, alongside saying that sex is a cluster concept, they say that it's chromosomal. And there are well-known scientific problems with that. One of them is that actually a lot of people who are phenotypically male or female, in the most, traditional and pronounced way, they sometimes turn out to be chromosomatically exactly the opposite of what you'd expect from what they appear to be. So there are people who are intersex. There are also people who are phenotypically female, but genotypically, chromosomatically male. So for all those reasons, I don't see why anyone would think that it's more than a religious dogma to think that sex is immutable and that birth sex is what counts and nothing else does. I mean, what is true is that you can't go back in a time machine and alter the sex that you were assigned at birth. That's true. But if sex is the cluster concept, suppose there are 5 criteria, and at the moment science can change just one of them, then science improves and it can change 2, then science improves a bit more and now it can change 3 out of 5 of the cluster concepts. Now, at that point, if you really think that sex is a cluster concept, then you ought to say, well, it's no longer true that sex is immutable. That's changed because science has advanced.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It sounds like they would have to bite the bullet in some way, right? They would either have to say, well, no, sex is not a cluster concept and just kind of revert back to a different position, or they would have to accept, no, some people can change their sex, or at least it may come to a point where a person is more male than female or more female than male. Okay.
What if we discovered a way of triggering a sort of cascade effect in the chromosomes? I mean, I've no idea how this would happen scientifically, but then science is full of things that I have no idea about. What if there was a way of triggering a cascade effect in the chromosomes, which meant that someone, on Tuesday they're XY, and by Wednesday they're XX? I mean, I can't see how that would be possible myself, but like I say, science does lots of things that I can't see how they're possible. And if that happened, then even the retreat to chromosomal sex would no longer work for the trans-exclusionaries. What would they get dogmatic about then? Well, perhaps they'd get dogmatic about sex assigned at birth. And perhaps they'd have to go on being dogmatic about that until someone invents a time machine.
So I think a lot of people who don't understand this issue see sex as a trait or property that we share with other animals. So, whatever it is that makes this particular turtle or a kangaroo or a cat female is what makes this human being female.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Well, I'm a bit holding back on a decision there, because if someone starts with that line, then I want to see where they go next. So if someone came up with that line in a conversation, I'd say, okay, and what do you think follows from that? What I would say in a more direct answer to what you just said is, if that's how it is, then the chromosomatic basis of the sexual binary in other species is actually often very different. It's not XY against XX, it's ABC against FD or something. In other species, it's very different. So if you're saying that there's something that is what makes creatures male and female in this species, then it doesn't look like the chromosomes can be the same basis throughout. It looks like function, actually, would be a better thing to go for. If that's the game you're playing, you want something that is the same in all species, that makes them male and female. Then reproductive function. So you could say something like, well, the males are the ones that produce the small gamete, the females are the ones that produce the large gamete, and the females are the ones that do the gestation of the blastocyst, at least in mammals. And then you think, oh, whoops, there might be some species, there are certainly science fiction species that do things differently, and the male is the one who does the gestating, or we want to call them the male, but do we now want to call them male because they do the gestating, and that's supposed to be part of the female function, and so it gets complicated. And then, of course, there are other species, I think I'm right, which are mammalian, even on planet Earth, not in science fiction. I think I'm right in saying that seahorses typically are a species where it's the male who does the gestation.
Yeah,
I may or may not be right about that. There are certainly humans and fish where, the growth of the eggs happens mostly inside the male fish's mouth.
Yeah, I felt like when I was trying to understand what the concept of sex meant, it paralleled a lot of other thought process that I had when doing philosophy, right? And I just concluded that it's really hard to define something. We're trying to come up with the necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for something, and it's just really hard. At first, I thought it was something like chromosomes. I thought it was XX or XY, but then I did a little more reading. It's like, okay, well, it can't be that, especially if it has to be true for other animals, because I think like crocodiles or alligators, like they don't have that distinction. I believe sea turtles as well.
That's right.
They have like the same chromosomes, and what determines the sex of the turtle is the temperature in which the eggs are in, or something like that. So then it was like, okay, well, it can't be that. So then, what is it? Yeah, the best and most coherent definition that I've come up with is, it has something to do with what you said, right? It's about your function. It's about the gametes, the size of gametes that your body produces, or at least the gametes that your body is supposed to produce, I guess, because something can go wrong with your body.
Yeah.
And
well, that's right. Yes, you've got generics mixed as well.
Yeah, right. And you can also get injured. Maybe like after a certain age, you stop producing those gametes, right? There's always going to be these exceptions. So again, it's going to be hard to define. But yeah, so anyway, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. But so let's say that let's say we did eventually come up with the best conception of sex, and it seemed like that, at least with our current technology, it's something that cannot be changed. Is that necessarily problematic? It doesn't seem to be a problem to accepting trans people and their self-ID, would it?
I think that's right. It isn't necessarily a problem at all. I mean, it's emerged from the little biological discussion we just had, that if you want a strict biological definition of sex, then it's not what we probably started off thinking about in this discussion, and what people are thinking of a lot of the time, which is body shape and body appearance. It's not that. Sex is not that kind of concept, strictly speaking, in biology, and neither is it the kind of concept which comes through to biology from physics. It's not a simple physical concept like momentum or mass. It's a bit like the kind of functional role concepts that you get within a bee's nest, for example. So there's queen, there's worker, there's drone, there's other kind of functions within a bee's nest, within a beehive, and it looks like sex is relational in the way that those functions are, because what my sex is depends on what I can do in interaction with other creatures of the same species, assuming we're not injured, etc., and assuming things go normally, etc., etc., etc. So sex is really complicated, and as you say, we can hold all of that constant, we can hold all of that fixed, and say, well, actually, there are people who want to change their sex in the following sense. They start out with the body of the one of the two shapes which are on offer in the binary, and they want a body of the other shape that's on offer in the binary. And that's roughly my situation. And then we say, well, okay, there are people like that. What to do about them? Well, why not treat them with humanity, respect, and solidarity? And why not, as far as possible, make it easy for them to live their lives in the way that makes sense to them, even if you don't get it yourself? None of that seems to me remotely difficult. I mean, one of my mottos in ethics is very simply, play nicely. And a lot of the time, humans do not seem capable of playing nicely, which is very unfortunate for all of us.
It is very unfortunate. Some of these, gender critical people, I get the sense that there's a lot of antagonism there, mean-spirited commentary, and I find that to be just very unnecessary, very, very unsimple, and it makes me uncomfortable. Just like, and my personality is such that I want everybody to get along, So the last question that I had,
Nice.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. So the last question I had was in regards to this phrase, gender assigned at birth or sex assigned at birth. I hear it used a lot, and I also hear, I guess, like the more skeptical people, I get a sense of frustration from them because of how often it's used in the way that it's used. I think that for some of the skeptics, it's not actually what they're talking about. Like when we're talking about someone's sex, it's not necessarily what's, something that's assigned at birth, even though it is assigned at birth, right? But it's not what makes the sex of the baby the sex of the baby, right? So for instance, let's imagine a society where people actually did not assign the sex of the baby at birth. They just didn't write it down or anything. If that were the case, then it doesn't seem like anything would change, right? Like just because you're not assigned a particular sex at birth does not make it so that you are not trans, right? You're still going to be trans. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Yes, I would. I think you'd still be trans because, we got 4 children, and it is when you see a child born, you cannot help, you naturally note the sex of the child when the child is born. And I certainly did that. We both did that with all our children, and that's a natural thing to do. And of course, it doesn't preclude the possibility that a child might turn out to be transgender. But I'm not as far, I'm not as far into the trans mindset, the mindset that some trans people have, that I'm particularly at ease, or I don't find it natural to think that sex is just something that we assign. I think it's obvious what sex babies are, mostly. Nonetheless, I think despite that, and for 2 things following on from that, first of all, there's no need to gender stereotype anyone. There's no need to say, this baby is bound to be empathetic and to love pink, etc., because of the shape of their body when they were born. And this one's likely to like Meccano sets and fighting because of the shape of their body when they were born. You don't have to gender stereotype them as, like that. And the other useful thing about the phrase sex assigned at birth or gender assigned at birth, the other useful thing about it is it reminds us that there are a small number of babies which are born intersex, and they have some of the biological features, the physical features of both of the two sexes in the binary. And I think there is a pretty scandalous history of so-called corrective surgery. I think it's obvious with babies that are born intersex that there's a very strong case for saying, well, let them be and let them choose when they get older. And that's certainly something that may not always have been a possible medical choice or an easy one. It's clearly possible now, given what's possible for trans people. So I think the phrase sex assigned at birth as its use is, I also think it's perfectly natural and intuitive to say, if someone says to you, what was your baby then? Was it a boy or a girl? Normally, it's perfectly natural to say a boy or a girl, as the case may be. And it's not particularly natural, or anyway, I don't find it natural to say, we don't know. They haven't told us yet. That's a line I got from my favourite trans cartoonist, Sophie Grace, who has a child minding a baby in a pram, and a stranger on the park bench says, what sex is the baby? Is it a boy or a girl? And the childminder's response is, we don't know yet, they haven't told us. I don't find that a particularly natural way to talk, but I do think that it's got certain pleasing features. I think it shows a certain sensitivity to the child's wish to live their own life in their own way. And I think it displays an openness to trans people, which is delightful and wonderful. And I don't think it's in any way harmful to do that kind of thing. I don't think anyone is harmed by having small children playing with gender and playing with sex and deciding what they are for themselves. No one's harmed by that kind of thing. And there's a lot of fuss about it, which is just scaremongering, frankly.
All right. Well, I want to respect your time. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for your questions. It's been a pleasure.